Giacomo Casanova is a name that has become synonymous with seduction, a man so legendary that Casanova itself became a word meaning a great lover. But the real Casanova was far more complex and fascinating than the romantic myth. He wasn't just a seducer of women. He was a con artist, a gambler, a spy, an author, a mathematician, and a priest who abandoned his vows for a life of pleasure and adventure. He seduced over 100 women across Europe, from peasant girls to aristocratic ladies to nuns. He dined with kings and popes while simultaneously running elaborate scams. He was imprisoned in Venice's most infamous prison, the Leads, which was considered absolutely inescapable. And then he did the impossible. He escaped, becoming the only person in history to break out of the Leads and live to tell the tale. This is the true story of Giacomo Casanova, the monk who chose sin over salvation, the prisoner who defied the impossible, the man who turned his life into an adventure so outrageous that people still debate whether his memoirs are fact or elaborate fiction. This is about ambition, sexuality, cunning, and one of history's most daring prison escapes. This is the real Casanova. Venice in the 18th century was a city of contradictions, the perfect breeding ground for someone like Casanova. Deeply Catholic, yet morally libertine, politically declining, yet culturally vibrant, rigidly hierarchical, yet offering opportunities for clever individuals to rise through talent and audacity. Into this world, on April 2nd, 1725, Giacomo Girolamo Casanova was born to actor parents, a profession that occupied an ambiguous social position somewhere between respectability and scandal. His father died when Giacomo was 8, and his mother, a beautiful actress, traveled constantly for work, essentially abandoning young Giacomo to be raised by his grandmother. This early maternal abandonment would shape Casanova's relationship with women for the rest of his life, creating a man who constantly sought feminine affection while simultaneously fearing emotional attachment. He would spend his entire life pursuing women, conquering them, and then fleeing before genuine intimacy became necessary. Despite his humble origins, Casanova was brilliant. He possessed an extraordinary memory, a gift for languages, and insatiable intellectual curiosity. His grandmother recognized his potential and ensured he received education far superior to his social class. By age 9, he was studying in Padua, excelling in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and philosophy. He was particularly gifted at mathematics, a skill he would later use in various gambling schemes and cons. At 17, following the path expected of bright young men from modest backgrounds, Casanova entered the Catholic seminary and took minor orders, becoming an abbé. The church offered education, social advancement, and financial security. Casanova never intended to become a devout priest. For him, the seminary was simply a stepping stone to better things, a way to gain education and connections while enjoying the privileges of clerical status without the burden of actual piety. His time as a religious student was marked by scandal from the beginning. Casanova was charming, handsome, witty, and utterly incapable of celibacy. He began seducing women while still in seminary, treating his vow of chastity as an inconvenient suggestion. He gambled, attended parties, wrote passionate love letters, and generally lived like a young aristocrat rather than a man preparing for holy orders. His superiors repeatedly reprimanded him, but Casanova had a talent for talking his way out of trouble, and his intellectual gifts made them reluctant to expel him completely. In 1741, at 16, Casanova officially became an abbé and began preaching in Venice. His first sermon was a disaster. He forgot his prepared text and had to improvise badly, causing the congregation to laugh. His second sermon went slightly better, but it became clear Casanova had no calling for religious life. What he did have was access to aristocratic households through his clerical position, and he used this access shamelessly to cultivate relationships with wealthy patrons and, more importantly, their wives and daughters. The turning point came when Senator Alvisa Gasparo Malipiero, a wealthy Venetian nobleman, took Casanova into his household as a protégé. This was exactly the opportunity Casanova had been seeking: entry into aristocratic society. He moved into Malipiero's palace and began living a double life. Officially a man of the cloth, practically a courtier and pleasure seeker. But Casanova's appetites destroyed this arrangement. He began an affair with Malipiero's mistress, the actress Teresa Emer, conducting it with remarkable audacity, literally under his patron's nose. When Malipiero discovered the betrayal, he threw Casanova out permanently. At 20, Casanova found himself without patron, without prospects, with a damaged reputation. Rather than reform his behavior, Casanova decided to simply become better at concealing it. He abandoned any pretense of religious vocation and embarked on a career as what the 18th century called an adventurer, essentially a well-educated con artist who lived by his wits. Over the next several years, Casanova traveled throughout Italy, engaging in various occupations and schemes. He worked as a military officer, without seeing combat. He played violin in theater orchestras. He tried his hand at alchemy, pretending to possess a secret knowledge of turning base metals into gold. He worked as a professional gambler, using his mathematical skills to gain advantages at cards and dice. And throughout all of this, he seduced women constantly, recording each conquest in detailed private notes that would eventually form his notorious memoirs. By 1755, Casanova had returned to Venice, living as a gentleman of leisure, supported primarily by gambling winnings and generous patrons. He dressed expensively, attended opera and theater regularly, hosted lavish dinner parties, and was known throughout Venetian society as a charming, cultured, and slightly scandalous figure. Life was good, but Casanova had made powerful enemies. His sexual adventures had humiliated influential men whose wives or daughters had fallen for his charms. His gambling left various aristocrats in debt to him, some suspecting cheating. His dabbling in alchemy and occult practices made religious authorities suspicious of heresy or black magic. That moment came in July 1755, when Venetian authorities arrested Casanova on charges that were never precisely specified, but apparently involved accusations of being a magician, a Freemason, and a libertine who corrupted public morals. He was 30 years old and about to enter the most famous prison in Venice, a place from which no one had ever escaped. The prison known as I Piombi, the Leads, was located directly under the lead roof of the Doge's palace in Venice. The cells were tiny, unbearably hot in summer, and freezing in winter, with low ceilings that made it impossible to stand fully upright. The lead roof absorbed heat during the day, turning cells into ovens where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners often went mad from the heat, the isolation, and the knowledge that they might spend the rest of their lives in these conditions without ever being formally tried or sentenced. On July 26, 1755, Casanova was arrested at his apartment in the middle of the night by agents of the state inquisitors, Venice's secret police. He was given no explanation for his arrest, allowed no opportunity to defend himself, told nothing about charges or how long he would be imprisoned. This was standard procedure for the inquisitors, who operated outside normal legal processes. Casanova was taken by gondola across Venice to the Doge's palace and locked in cell number 7 of the Leads. His cell was approximately 12 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling so low that Casanova, nearly 6 feet tall, had to stoop constantly. There was a small barred window providing minimal light and no ventilation. The cell contained only a wooden bed frame without mattress, a bucket for waste, and nothing else. During his first summer, Casanova nearly died from the heat. He developed fever, became delirious, and seriously considered suicide. Only his natural resilience and the arrival of slightly cooler autumn weather saved him. Casanova was allowed no visitors, no correspondence, no books except a prayer book, and no information about the outside world. The isolation was designed to break prisoners psychologically. Guards brought food once a day, pushing it through a slot without speaking. Prisoners were forbidden from communicating with each other. Some prisoners went insane. Others died. The Leads was not designed to rehabilitate, it was designed to make people disappear. For several months, Casanova sank into depression. The man who had lived for pleasure, conversation, intellectual stimulation, and feminine company was now buried alive in a tiny cell with nothing but his own thoughts. He later wrote that he contemplated suicide multiple times during this period. What saved him was his natural optimism, his intellectual resources, and eventually, a plan. Casanova realized that dwelling on misery would drive him mad. Instead, he began exercising his mind, reconstructing from memory entire books he had read, composing poetry, solving mathematical problems. He also began carefully observing everything about his prison: the routine of guards, the construction of the building, the behavior of other prisoners he occasionally glimpsed. He was looking for weaknesses, for possibilities, for any opportunity to escape. The breakthrough came when guards moved Casanova to a different cell, and during cleaning, failed to properly search all his possessions. Casanova had managed to acquire a piece of black marble that could be sharpened into a crude tool. More importantly, he had befriended Lorenzo, the guard who brought food, through consistent politeness and occasional small bribes. Through Lorenzo, Casanova smuggled a few items into his cell, including, crucially, a spike of iron about 18 inches long that had been intended for prison construction. Casanova realized that the iron spike, properly sharpened and used persistently, could break through wood and even stone. He spent weeks sharpening the spike against the stone floor of his cell, working only at night when noise was less likely to be noticed. His plan was audacious: dig through the wooden floor of his cell into the room below, then make his way through the palace and escape. He worked for months, spending every night scraping away at the floor, hiding wood shavings under his bed, replacing loose boards during the day so guards wouldn't notice. The work was exhausting, the conditions terrible, and discovery would mean an even worse cell with no possibility of escape. But Casanova persevered, driven by knowledge that his only other option was spending the rest of his life in hell. Then, when he was within days of breaking through the floor, disaster struck. The authorities decided to move him to a different cell. Everything he had worked for was about to be discovered. In desperation, Casanova managed to hide his iron spike inside a large prayer book and convinced guards to transfer the book to a neighboring prisoner, Father Marino Balbi, a renegade priest imprisoned on charges of sexual misconduct. This quick thinking saved both the tool and the escape plan, though Casanova would now need a new approach. After being moved to his new cell, Casanova managed to communicate with Father Balbi through coded messages written on backs of prayer book pages. He explained his escape plan and convinced Balbi to use the iron spike to break through the ceiling of his cell into the attic space beneath the lead roof. The plan was incredibly dangerous. They would need to break through multiple barriers, navigate through the attic of the Doge's palace in complete darkness, avoid guards, and somehow escape from one of the most heavily secured buildings in Venice. Father Balbi, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, agreed to the plan. Over several weeks, working only at night, Balbi used the iron spike to gradually break through the wooden ceiling of his cell. The noise was substantial, but fortunately, Balbi's cell was located in a section where sounds were less likely to be noticed. On the night of October 31st, 1756, Balbi finally broke through into the attic space. The first phase of the escape was complete. Now came the dangerous part. Balbi had to move through the attic to Casanova's cell, break through Casanova's ceiling from above, and help him up into the attic. This required navigating through a dark, cramped space filled with wooden beams, dust, and the risk of falling through the ceiling into a room full of guards. But Balbi, motivated by freedom, managed it. On the night of November 1st, 1756, All Saints' Day, when most guards were attending religious services, Balbi broke through Casanova's ceiling. Casanova later described the moment when he saw Balbi's face appear through the hole in his ceiling as one of the greatest joys of his life. After 15 months of imprisonment, he was about to escape. The two men squeezed through the opening into the attic, bringing the few possessions they could carry. They were now inside the palace structure, but far from free. The attic was a maze of wooden beams and lead roofing, oppressively hot despite November, and one wrong step could send them crashing through a ceiling or make enough noise to alert guards. The men had no map, no clear plan for exiting the palace, and no idea what obstacles they might face. They simply moved toward what they hoped was an external wall, crawling over beams, squeezing through tight spaces, trying to remain quiet. At one point, they had to break through a wooden partition using the iron spike, each blow creating noise that could alert guards. The tension was unbearable. After hours of crawling through the attic, they reached what appeared to be an external wall with a barred window facing the palace courtyard. Using the iron spike as a lever, they managed to break the bars loose and squeeze through the window, dropping down onto a narrow ledge running along the outside of the building. They were now outside the prison section, but still inside the palace complex, and dawn was approaching. If they were seen by anyone, guards would be summoned immediately, and their escape would end in failure and likely execution. The palace courtyard was overlooked by dozens of windows from various state offices and residential quarters. Guards patrolled regularly. The main gate was heavily guarded and locked. Casanova and Balbi needed to find another way out quickly. Casanova, drawing on his knowledge of Venetian architecture and his aristocratic bearing, made a bold decision. Rather than sneaking around like criminals, they would walk out the front door. He and Balbi climbed down from the ledge, entered the palace through an unlocked door leading to administrative offices, and simply started walking through the building as if they belonged there. Casanova's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Act like you're supposed to be there, and people will assume you are. He walked confidently, nodding to the few early morning staff they encountered, looking every bit like a gentleman who had spent the night at the palace on official business. They reached the main entrance just as the doors were being unlocked for the morning. A guard stood at the entrance, but Casanova simply smiled at him, said, "Good morning," and walked out as if leaving after an all-night meeting with officials. The guard, seeing a well-dressed gentleman and companion leaving early in the morning, simply assumed they were aristocrats who had been working late and nodded them through. Casanova and Balbi walked out of the Doge's palace, crossed the Piazza San Marco, and disappeared into the narrow streets of Venice. They had done the impossible. They had escaped from the Leads, the supposedly inescapable prison. They had broken through floors and ceilings, crawled through attics, climbed down walls, and walked out the front door. And they had done it all with nothing but an iron spike, patience, audacity, and Casanova's unshakable confidence. It remains one of the most daring prison escapes in history. Once outside the palace, Casanova and Balbi faced a new problem. They were still in Venice, a city where Casanova was well known and where agents of the state inquisitors would soon be searching everywhere. They needed to get out of Venice immediately. Casanova went to a trusted friend who provided them with money, clothing, and transportation. Within hours of their escape, the two men were in a boat heading toward the mainland. They traveled first to Mestre on the Venetian mainland, then continued northward toward the Austrian border. Casanova knew that Venice had treaties with various Italian states that would allow for his extradition if caught, so he needed to reach territory where Venetian law didn't apply. They traveled mostly at night, avoided main roads, used false names, and kept constantly on the move. The journey was exhausting and dangerous, but they made it. Within a week of escaping the Leads, Casanova crossed into Austrian territory and was beyond the reach of Venetian justice. Father Balbi soon separated from Casanova, heading off to pursue his own path. The two men had worked well together during the escape, but had little in common otherwise. They parted on good terms, each grateful to the other for their mutual escape. Casanova's first priority was to turn his escape into profit. He realized that his story was extraordinary, and that people would pay to hear it. He began telling the tale in aristocratic salons across Europe, embellishing certain details for dramatic effect, but keeping the core story true. His escape from the Leads made him famous. He was no longer just Giacomo Casanova, the charming Italian adventurer. He was Giacomo Casanova, the only man ever to escape from Venice's impregnable prison. This fame opened doors throughout Europe. Casanova traveled to Paris, where he was introduced to aristocratic society and quickly became a sensation. His combination of genuine culture, his exciting escape story, and his legendary charm made him welcome in the most exclusive salons. He met with philosophers, artists, aristocrats, and even royalty. He had affairs with actresses, noble women, and wealthy widows. He gambled at the most exclusive tables. He lived as luxuriously as he had before his imprisonment, perhaps even more so. But Casanova was not content to simply live off his reputation. In Paris, he became involved in establishing the French state lottery, using his mathematical skills to help design a system that would maximize revenue for the government while still appearing fair to players. This work earned him significant money and the gratitude of influential French officials. He also continued his romantic exploits with undiminished enthusiasm. His memoirs, written decades later, describe affairs with dozens of women across Europe during this period. Casanova had a genuine gift for seduction that went beyond mere physical attraction. He treated women as intellectual equals in an age when few men did. He listened to them, engaged them in serious conversation, respected their opinions, and made them feel valued and understood. For many women, especially aristocratic women trapped in loveless arranged marriages, this was profoundly appealing. Over the next decade, Casanova traveled throughout Europe: Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and many smaller cities. He met with Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Voltaire. He worked variously as a spy, a financial consultant, a theatrical impresario, and a writer. He made fortunes and lost them gambling. He fought duels. He was imprisoned briefly in several cities for various offenses, but never for long. He seduced women everywhere he went, keeping detailed notes about each affair. Despite his success, Casanova longed to return to Venice. It was his home, the city he loved above all others. He missed the culture, the beauty, the sophistication of Venetian life. For years, he negotiated with Venetian authorities, offering his services as a spy, promising to behave, pleading for forgiveness. Finally, in 1774, 18 years after his escape, Venice granted him a pardon and allowed him to return. Casanova returned to Venice at 49, but the city had changed, and so had he. The Venice of 1774 was in decline, its power and wealth diminishing as other European powers grew stronger. The freewheeling, morally libertine atmosphere of Casanova's youth was giving way to a more conservative, fearful society worried about revolution and change, and Casanova himself was no longer the young, dashing adventurer who had escaped from prison. He was middle-aged, increasingly out of touch with younger generations and running out of money. He took a job working as a spy for the Venetian Inquisitors, the same organization that had once imprisoned him. The irony was not lost on Casanova, but he needed the income. His work involved informing on potential subversives, monitoring foreign visitors, and gathering intelligence. It was not glamorous work, and it put him in the uncomfortable position of betraying people who trusted him. His romantic life also declined. He was still interested in women and occasionally successful, but age and diminishing resources made seduction more difficult. The aristocratic women who had once found him irresistible now viewed him as a relic. Younger women saw him as an old man. His financial situation became increasingly precarious as gambling debts accumulated. In 1782, Casanova made a serious mistake. He published a satirical pamphlet attacking a Venetian nobleman, and the backlash was severe. The authorities, tired of Casanova's troublemaking, made it clear he was no longer welcome in Venice. At 57, Casanova left his beloved city for the last time, knowing he would never return. He spent his final years working as a librarian for Count Waldstein at Duck's Castle in Bohemia. It was a position far below what Casanova felt he deserved, a humiliating end for someone who had dined with kings. He was lonely, bitter, increasingly ill, and tormented by memories of his glorious past. The castle was remote, the work boring, and his fellow staff found him arrogant and difficult. But during these final years, Casanova did something that would ensure his immortality. He began writing his memoirs. Working in French, he wrote approximately 3,700 pages describing his life, his adventures, and most notoriously, his sexual conquests. The memoirs were titled Histoire de ma vie, Story of My Life. He wrote with extraordinary detail, describing events from decades earlier, conversations he had had, women he had seduced, schemes he had executed. He wrote about sex with remarkable frankness, describing not just the act itself, but the psychology of seduction, the emotions involved, and specific details of each encounter. Casanova died on June 4, 1798, at 73, in the library at Duck's Castle. His last words were reportedly, "I have lived as a philosopher and die as a Christian," though this may be apocryphal. For over a century after his death, Casanova was largely forgotten. The manuscript of Casanova's memoirs remained unpublished for decades. Count Waldstein's family retained it, recognizing its potential value, but uncertain whether to publish something so sexually explicit. In 1820, a German publisher purchased the manuscript and began preparing an edited version for publication. The first edition, published in German in the 1820s, was heavily censored. Entire chapters were cut. Sexual descriptions were removed. Names were changed. It wasn't until 1960 that the complete, uncensored manuscript was finally published. This complete version revealed Casanova as an extraordinarily gifted writer and one of the most important sources we have for understanding 18th century European society. Historians initially approached the memoirs with skepticism. Could these stories really be true? But as researchers checked Casanova's claims against other historical sources, they discovered something remarkable. He was telling the truth. When Casanova claimed to have met Voltaire on a specific date, records confirmed both men were in the same location. When he described people, places, and events, other sources verified his descriptions. Modern scholars now regard Casanova's memoirs as one of the most valuable historical sources for 18th century European life. He wrote about things that most respectable writers ignored: the reality of sexual relationships, the experience of travel, the mechanisms of gambling and cons, the inner workings of aristocratic households, the treatment of women, and the day-to-day reality of life in dozens of European cities. So who was the real Casanova? He was a man born into the lower classes who spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged among the aristocracy. His constant seductions were not just expressions of sexual appetite, but desperate attempts to prove his worth through conquest. His elaborate cons were about demonstrating that he was cleverer than the aristocrats who looked down on him. His obsessive memoir writing was a final attempt to ensure that history would remember him as significant. Yet for all his flaws, Casanova was genuinely talented. His prison escape was real and required extraordinary courage, patience, and ingenuity. His work on the French lottery demonstrated genuine mathematical ability. His charm was not just superficial manipulation, but reflected genuine wit, empathy, and emotional intelligence. He really did treat women as intellectual equals, which was revolutionary for his era. The escape from the Leads remains Casanova's most impressive achievement. The Venetian authorities confirmed the escape. Other prisoners described hearing it. The physical evidence was documented. The escape was real, it was brilliant, and it deserved the fame it brought him. More than 200 years after his death, Giacomo Casanova is still famous. His name has entered the language, his memoirs are still read, his prison escape is still celebrated. He was a monk who abandoned God for pleasure, a prisoner who achieved the impossible, a seducer who wrote with genuine insight about women, a con artist who told the truth in his memoirs. He was, in short, exactly what he claimed to be, a man who lived fully, passionately, recklessly, and without apology. The Libertine monk who escaped from prison died in obscurity but achieved immortality through his words. Whatever else he was, Giacomo Casanova lived.